This video is brought to you by AudioQuest, makers of the Dragonfly range of USB DACs. Click to AudioQuest.com for more information.
A few years ago, we looked at a very fancy stand mount speaker and Tensegrity stand combo from Q Acoustics. And that was called the Concept 300. It sold for, I believe, €4,000 a pair. Today, we're going to look at a newer model. I guess we would call it a baby brother of that Concept 300. This newer model is called the Concept 30. It sells for €1,200 a pair. And that means it lands right in territory already occupied by the Sonus Faber Lumina 2 and the KEF LS50 Meta. So we're going to find out today how the new Q Acoustics Concept 30 stacks up against the competition. So on the front of the Concept 30, you'll notice a sort of surround around the drivers. That is a 3mm thick front baffle plate. So the drivers, the tweeter and the mid-bass driver are mounted to that plate, and then the plate, which is acoustically damped, is then fitted to the cabinet. And the cabinet, I've got to say, the fit and finish here is just mwah. It's remarkable. This is one of the nicest looking and well-built or visually appealing speakers at this price point that I won't say that I've ever seen. It's certainly a lot nicer to look at in terms of fit and finish for me than the Sonus Faber. And it's on par with KEF's build quality. It really is just superb. I should mention that the drivers here feature, I guess they call it trickle-down technology from the Concept 300. They are sort of bespoke drivers. They're not off the shelf. They're made specifically for this loudspeaker. On the back, there's a rear port. So this is a bass reflex speaker. And there are two sets of binding posts for people that like to buy amp or buy wire. I'm not one of those people, but it's there if you want it. And also, I've got to say, yeah, the binding posts, they also look lovely. One of the defining features from an engineering perspective of Q Acoustics loudspeakers, not all models, but many models throughout the last 10 years, has been something called gel core. Now what that is basically, so for example, in the Concept 300, so the €4,000 a pair speaker, there were 3 different cabinet layers, and then between each layer was this sort of gel-like layer that would absorb, I believe, high-frequency vibrations and turn that into heat. Inside the Concept 30, there are only 2 layers, but there is a gel core layer sort of filling out that sandwich. So that, for me, I think is really interesting. I don't know of many other companies that do that. And yeah, I just think it's just worth noting here because it seems to be, I hate it when people say somewhat unique because it's either unique or it isn't, right? But I'm going to say it's somewhat unique. Also interesting from a cabinet build perspective is that the bottom plate, so basically where the speaker sort of joins the stand, and I'm on about any stand here, you don't need to get these Tensegrity stands that are optional that sell for, I think about €400. They're not cheap. You don't have to use these as you did with the Concept 300. But these are different stands. These are not tripod stands. These are, I guess you call them quadruped stands. There's 4 legs on them. They're still Tensegrity. Anyway, so inside the speaker, there are 2 base plate layers that are decoupled from one another using, I think, some spheres, some balls. So what that means is that the speaker has a little bit of movement on its mounting. Now that is designed, I think, to stop vibrations that sort of emanate around the room and then hit the floor and then come up the stand and into the speaker. Now, why that might be a problem is also related to the crossover because the crossover is mounted to the upper base plate. So it too is, in theory, according to Q Acoustics, shielded from unwanted vibrations. I've got no way of testing this as to whether it's true or whether it's effective or not. I guess it's just like the gel core layer. Like I can impart what I've learned, but I can't tell you if it does any good. I mean, I've no idea whether gel core or the decoupled base plate has any impact on this speaker because we can't remove them. But again, they're interesting, I think, from my point of view, and therefore I think they might be interesting from your point of view. Oh, and if you don't know what Tensegrity is, I'll put a link in the description box below so you can read up on that. So let's dive into this loudspeaker's sound as I hear it. Now, I would say that this speaker, the Concept 30, communicates a suggestion, a hint of neutrality / accuracy, but we can't really know for sure, right? Anybody that tells you they know what accuracy sounds like, gotta say, I think they're daydreaming. I really do, because we weren't there and all the other reasons. I'm not gonna go into it here. I'm not gonna weigh down this video with yet another diatribe on why the idea of accuracy is a bit of a nonsense. But anyway, I know when people say they think a speaker is accurate or neutral, I think I know what they're getting at, because it's usually sort of a cooler, more even sound, like a flat frequency response as they hear it, so with no sort of obvious bumps or dips in the frequency response, even if it's sort of tipped up like that or tipped down like that. So this loudspeaker, there are suggestions of neutrality, I think. It's quite a cool sounding speaker, but there's also, interestingly, shades of warmth. Well, no, it's not really warmth. It's more sort of like a richness or a softness that appears every now and again. It's not always noticeable. So this is definitely not some kind of like window wipe, squeegee clean kind of speaker, not at all, but it is quite cool sounding. Yeah, with sort of, it's a bit like taking like a double espresso and just putting like a pipette, a couple of drops full of milk into that coffee. Think of it that way. Yeah, a bit pretentious. I've been on a bit of a kick with Boards of Canada's debut album recently. Well, it's not their debut album, but it's their debut album for Warp. Music Has the Right to Children. And I'm absolutely convinced that the Concept 30 staged that album's sort of melancholic drama with as much width and height as the Sonus Faber and the KEF. But I think maybe the Concept 30 can't quite match the KEF on soundstage depth. But I'm nitpicking there. So now we're into side-by-side comparisons, right? This speaker versus two other loudspeakers. Yeah, I think the Concept 30 doesn't quite have the sort of upper mid-range clarity and urgency as the KEF LS50 Meta. I mean, the Q Acoustic speakers do sound a little bit crisp sometimes, but they're not as crisp in that sort of, yeah, upper mid, lower treble region as the KEFs. But if you demand sort of the ultimate in crispness with plenty of zap and zing in the top end, then you really still want the Sonus Faber Lumina 2, because they are the most exciting speaker, I think, for rock and roll of the three here. So if we flip that around, unlike the Sonus Faber, to a lesser extent, unlike the KEF, the Concept 30 give us a sort of delicacy and tenderness in the treble that prevents the speaker from sounding too lively, but also stops it from sounding too strained at times, which by contrast in some ways, especially when compared to the KEF, that can sort of hinder the Concept 30's talents or keep it on a tighter leash with microdynamic flair. So that all the little sort of ticks and pops and micro actions, yeah, all the kind of the smaller sounds that might sort of dart out at you are a little bit more restrained at the hands of the Q Acoustics than the KEFs, and definitely the Sonus Fabers. But because the Concept 30 isn't as lit up in the sort of lower treble, upper mids as the other two, especially the Sonus Faber, it also means that its talents with layer separation comes on as more natural and more organic. However, I do want to say that In the mid-range, I think the Concept 30 sometimes lacks the detail that I want and I get from the KEF, the Sonus Faber. I haven't kind of worked that out yet. I'm sorry, I don't know. But despite all of this, or maybe because of all of this, the Q Acoustics loudspeakers still have plenty of rhythmic snap. So another album I've been hammering recently is David Byrne's 1993 album. I think it's just called David Byrne. And there's a track on there called You and I, as in I, and it's full of sort of Latin percussion. And I love the way that the Concept 30 really sort of delivers that nicely. So not too much, not too little. I mean, the Sonus Faber really sort of pulls that percussion right to the front of the song, whereas with the Concept 30, it sits a little bit further back. And for that particular track, I prefer the Concept 30's take. So if you're picking up that the Q Acoustics Concept 30 is the more polite, the more reserved of these three loudspeakers, you would be absolutely right. But how you feel about that depends upon what kind of listener you are. Because if you're a fan of, say, like really, really lively music, let's say you listen to a lot of Latin music with lots of percussion and snaps and just very kind of, I don't know how you would say this, maybe staccato sounds, very abrupt sounds, then I think the Concept 30 would give you the most balanced take on those than, say, the KEF or the Sonus Faber. Equally, it would also suit somebody who listens to a lot of female vocal, like Kate Bush, Joanna Newsom and Björk, especially the female vocals that get more and more excited and can get a little bit sibilant at times. So the Q Acoustics keep a lid on that. I mean, some of the Joanna Newsom stuff through the Sonus Faber, oh, it's a bit too much. Yeah, I guess what I'm talking about here is stridency with female vocals. The Q Acoustics keep everything very even and stop it becoming, yeah, unpleasant or I guess exhausting, you know, tiring. We don't want a loudspeaker to be tiring, especially if we're listening for hours and hours and hours on end. For me, the Sonus Faber would be exhausting if I were to listen to nothing but something like the Mountain Goats all day long, because that's very strident American indie rock. Like I would just be wiped out after an all-day listening session with that, but not so with the Q Acoustics. And the Concept 30 are also great for people who've got lively sounding amplifiers. So I mainly use these with the NAD M10 V2. For me, that's a lively sounding amplifier, much more so than the V1. And I think it's a great fit. I think these sort of livelier sounding Class D amplifiers would be a good fit for the Q Acoustics. Now, one thing that stand mount speakers in the main, in general, one of their weaknesses is you have to really turn the volume up to get them to come fully on song, right? This is my experience over the years. The Q Acoustics are no different in that regard. But I did last night play an EP that I've not played for a long time. I think it's called the Theatre EP or the Theatre 2 EP. It's by an electronic musician called Recondite. He was very popular about 5 years ago, probably less so now. But this Theatre 2 EP is just, well, it starts out a bit duffy. So don't play the first track and then find yourself repelled. Go straight to track 3. That is probably a good place to start on this EP because it's less confronting if you're not used to sort of duffy electronic music. Anyway, so I really wound the volume on the Q Acoustics last night with this EP, and I got plenty, like I mean plenty of bass wallop and low end from the Q Acoustics. Now that doesn't mean to say that they're as good as a floor stander. Of course they're not. That would be absurd to say that. So I generally find that with a loudspeaker like this, especially nowadays, I know I used to listen to just these kinds of things, you know, for the first, 8 years I was doing this job. Although I will say, actually, this is why I got into headphones, because I was listening to just stand mount loudspeakers, but in order to kind of track the bass of certain songs or bits of equipment, and especially DACs, I'd use headphones. But nowadays, yeah, subwoofers with these kinds of loudspeakers for me are, yeah, pretty much essential. And the Q Acoustics are no exception. I personally want a subwoofer with these, even though I could live with them without, just about, but I'd have to turn the volume up so I get the full effect or the full force of the low end that these speakers are capable of, because at low volumes, not so much. And low volumes are what subs are really good at, or good at improving, again, in my experience. So I added the KEF KC62 to the Q Acoustics using the NAD's inbuilt bass management system, so the crossover, again, set at 80 Hertz. So all I had to set myself was the gain on the back of the sub. And yeah, just wow, what a wonderful sounding system. And I think if you price that, if you put the stand mounts with the sub, with the KEF sub, it's the same price as the floor standing version of these loudspeakers. I think they're called the Concept 50. So that then begs the question, like, which one should you get? Or yeah, people are going to ask me, should I get the floor standers, the Concept 50, or should I get the Concept 30 stand mounts on the sub? Now, I would say that if you're in a smallish room, as I am here, 6 meters by 5 meters, go with the stand mounts and the sub. Let me explain why. I think I did this in a video last week. When you buy the floor standers, the bass output of those loudspeakers is fixed. It's designed into the speaker, it's built in, unless of course you use EQ, but I'm not assuming that's present here. But with the sub and the stand mounts, you can adjust the bass output of the sub, right? You can turn the volume up or down. You can move the bass around the room, because in a floor standing speaker, the bass units are in each loudspeaker unit, right? You can't move them around the room, but a sub you can. So I think in a smaller room, a sub with stand mounts gives you more flexibility. However, I think the downside of that, and this is something I've learned from listening to a lot of floor standing actives recently, is that a floor stander compared to stand mounts with a sub tends in the main, in my experience in general, to sound a little bit more effortless in delivering the sort of the majesty of sound, if you like, the kind of the weight and the scale. I think stand mounts and subs tend to sound just a little bit smaller and can sound like they're trying really hard to deliver the same thing as the comparable floor stander. But in a room like this, for me, the bass flexibility is more important. The bass flexibility that is brought by a sub is more important to me. But if we take the subwoofer out of the picture, because obviously I'm not going to review these stand mounts with the sub in play, what we tend to get from loudspeakers like this, from stand mounts, is more of a suggestion of low bass than the actual low bass itself, because Q Acoustics rate the Concept 30 as -6 dB down at 54 Hertz. If we compare that to the KEF, who rate their LS50 Meta as -6 dB down at 47 Hertz, you can hear the difference when you play them side by side. Again, with another side-by-side comparison, putting the KEF next to Q Acoustics, the KEF give us a stronger suggestion of low bass than do the Q Acoustics. That's not really a big deal for me, I don't think, because the great thing about a speaker that isn't trying to reach or hasn't been designed for it to force its drivers to go as low as possible is they tend to pick up a little bit in what I perceive as speed, because it's not trying to do the low bass, it just comes on as a little bit snappier, a bit faster, which is why I described earlier on in this video the Q Acoustics as sounding very snappy and rhythmically driven with sort of more complex percussive music. And I think that's the case compared to the KEF. So even though they don't go quite as low, they're a little bit zippier. But if you wanted to try this for yourself at home and you want to hear what I hear, then you need to find a track by DJ Cozy called Ecstasy. That's spelled XTC. And it's a fairly straightforward 4-to-the-floor techno cut. But it has a nice sort of plump, fat bass kick that I think, for me, is really good at assessing, yeah, sort of how much low bass is on offer or delivered by a loudspeaker. Whilst we're talking recommended music, this is an album called Power Clown by an outfit called Fila Brazillia. I think this is their 5th album. Came out at the end of the 90s. This is fantastic, and I think audiophile type people who don't like electronic music will love this, because it isn't really electronic music, even though their earlier, well, certainly the first 2 albums were sort of more house and then ambient based, but this one is much more, I guess it's funk. Like the first track, Bovine Funk, is kind of sets the tone. There's a lot of weirdness sort of threaded through with vocal samples to stop it becoming too much like some kind of retro funk party, which is why I like it. Because I'm not necessarily a massive fan of funk music, but this, I think it's wonderful. Like it's such a really interesting record. And I think you would like that too. And I listen to this a lot whilst demoing the Q Acoustics Concept 30 loudspeakers. Oh, and I would say, if you're wondering about the Sonus Faber, I'd say that, yeah, the Q Acoustics' low-end performance is more on par with the Lumina 2 than the KEF. So if you're now asking yourself, well, John, which one of these 3 speakers, the KEF, the Sonus Faber, or the Q Acoustics, is best? You know, you might be thinking that. Well, I'm going to answer that question with another question. What's the best flavour of ice cream? See, there just isn't one. There isn't, well, certainly with these loudspeakers, it's a bit like ice cream. Everybody has a personal preference, because none of these loudspeakers that I've put in this video have any major flaws. None of them, I would think, are too strong a flavour to alienate the majority of the audience. I guess the Sonus Faber would come closest to that, but even then, I think as much as it would alienate a bunch of people, it would also, and I'm one of these, draw a lot of other people closer, because it's a very specific, very exciting kind of sound. The Q Acoustics is not like that. It's much more reserved, more even, more balanced, more neutral. But it is, it's a more agreeable sort of everyman kind of loudspeaker. I think more people would like the Q Acoustics than the Sonus Faber. I don't know about more people would like the Q Acoustics and the KEF. I'm not so sure about that. I think it would be just different people in equal measure, if I had to guess. Just as there would be an equal number of people that would prefer vanilla ice cream and another bunch of people that would like chocolate ice cream. Right? It's just like ice cream. Basically, if you've heard the KEF LS50 Meta or the Sonus Faber Lumina 2 and find them both too lively up top, too sort of in your face in terms of upper mid-range, then you're really going to love the Concept 30 from Q Acoustics. And you'll especially enjoy the Concept 30 if you listen to like Ministry and Idols and The Secret Machines and Metallica all day, if you're that kind of listener. Because you can do that with these loudspeakers without sort of getting to the end of the day feeling like you've gone 10 rounds with Mike Tyson. So yeah, that's my take on the Concept 30 from Q Acoustics. They absolutely do fit in the marketplace next to the KEF and the Sonus Faber and probably lots of other loudspeakers at that sort of 1,000 to 1,500 euro price point. This particular market segment for speakers is really hotting up in my book. And we've got another one coming, actually. That's why I requested that other one, so I could compare it to the Q Acoustics. So I think it's fantastic that a relatively new company like Q Acoustics have managed to position themselves on par with KEF and Sonus Faber. I think that's brilliant. So well done to them. So if you like this video, please consider giving us a like down below. If you like my attitude towards high-end audio, in that very often when you're operating at a very highly competitive price point, So when you're comparing things at the same price point, and that price point is very closely fought by a number of manufacturers, it's almost impossible to pick a best or a winner, because those manufacturers are juicing everything they can from their bill of materials. So there isn't really a clear winner. So if you can live with that, then please consider subscribing to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. If you're asking yourself, how does the Concept 30 compare to the Concept 300 that I had a couple of years ago? I'm sorry, I've no idea, because obviously that Concept 300 speaker is no longer here. And I only really do side-by-side comparisons for, I guess, obvious reasons. If you're thinking, well, how does the Concept 30 compare to another loudspeaker that's not in this video? Again, can't tell you, got no idea, because I haven't done that comparison. I don't have that loudspeaker. So please understand that what you see in this video is what you get. WYSIWYG, and I sincerely hope that this 20-minute-ish video was informative and entertaining enough to justify the cost of entry to you, i.e. having to watch an ad or two at the start or in the middle.